Pastor Mrs. Nancy sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked tired, not from physical work, but from an ache deep in her heart. Her husband, Pastor Kunle, was in the living room, his Bible opened, his lips moving silently as he read. It was a familiar sight, one that once filled her with admiration, but now left her feeling empty. Nancy hadn't always felt this way. When she first met Kunle, she was drawn to his passion for God. He was a firebrand, always praying, always fasting, always speaking words of faith that could move even mountains. Kunle wasn't just a pastor. He was a man devoted to his calling, and it was inspiring. When they prayed together about their future, both received a confirmation from God that they were meant to be partners. Nancy believed with all her heart that marrying Kunle was God's will. But marriage to a pastor wasn't what she had imagined. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was always hard. Kunle's time was constantly demanded by the church. He would wake up before dawn to pray, often spending hours interceding for his members. By the time Nancy woke up, he was already deep in study, preparing sermons or responding to calls from people in need. "Pastor, my child just fainted." Someone would call late at night. Kunle would rush to his phone, praying fervently, sometimes even leaving the house to visit. The testimonies from this moment were endless. Church members would stand before the congregation, tears streaming down their faces, sharing how Pastor Kunle's prayers brought healing, deliverance, and breakthroughs. "I called Pastor Kunle at midnight when my husband couldn't breathe. He prayed, and within minutes, my husband was fine," one woman shared. "Pastor Kunle is truly a man of God," another declared. Nancy would smile on the outside, but inside, she felt a twinge of jealousy. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate her husband's work. She did, but she longed for the kind of attention and care he gave to the church. Kunle tried his best to balance his responsibilities. He would help her in the kitchen, assist with chores, and occasionally take her out for dinner. Yet, Nancy wanted more. She wanted 90% of his time, not the leftover moments after he had given everything to the church. One night, after a particularly long day, Nancy decided to talk to Kunle. "Kunle, we need to talk," she said as they sat together in the living room. Kunle looked up from his Bible, concern etched on his face. "What is it, my love?" I feel like I'm not a priority anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "You're always busy with the church. I know you are doing God's work, but what about us?" Kunle sighed deeply and reached for her hand. "Nancy, I love you. You're my wife, my partner, but this calling, it's not just mine, it's ours. I need your support to do what God has called me to do." Nancy nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to support him, but she also wanted to feel loved, cherished, and seen. Was that too much to ask? As the days turned into weeks, Nancy tried to adjust. She busied herself with church activities, leading the women's group, and helping with charity outreaches. Yet, the emptiness lingered. She felt like she was living in Kunle's shadow, always playing second fiddle to his ministry. One day, during service, the ushers welcomed first-timers, and Nancy's eyes fell on a tall, handsome man with a well-built body. He had a quiet confidence about him, and she couldn't help but notice how striking he looked. "Welcome to our church," Pastor Kunle announced from the pulpit, but Nancy's mind was already elsewhere. She quickly shook off the thought, rebuking herself. "God forbid! I'm a pastor's wife. What am I even thinking?" she muttered under her breath. But that wasn't the end of it. The man, whose name was Tade, began worshipping regularly in their church. He wasn't just a regular member. Tade was deeply committed. He was well versed in the word, always contributing to the church growth by making donations and sowing seeds. He catered for the welfare of the church and became an active participant in every service. Tade's generosity knew no bounds. He would give to the pastor and his wife, sponsor church programs, and provide for the less privileged. He often said, "The more I give, the more God blesses me." And it seemed true. He prospered greatly, and his wealth became a testimony of God's faithfulness. For Nancy, Tade's presence stirred feelings she couldn't control. At first, she prayed fervently to suppress them, but the more she saw him, the more she struggled. She found herself dressing more elegantly for service, hoping to catch his eye. She would deliberately find reasons to speak with him after church, often under the guise of thanking him for his contributions. Tade was nothing like Kunle. Where Kunle was intense and deeply spiritual, Tade was light-hearted and charming. He had a way of making everyone laugh, including Nancy. At first, their conversations were casual, discussing church events, planning charity work. But as time went on, Nancy found herself looking forward to seeing Tade. He noticed things about her that Kunle never seemed to. "That's a lovely dress, Mrs. Nancy," he said one day. She blushed, unused to such compliments. "Thank you, Bro Tade." Their interactions were innocent at first, but Nancy couldn't deny the thrill she felt whenever he was around. It was as if a part of her that had been asleep was waking up. She felt seen, appreciated, even desired. But with that thrill came guilt. She was a pastor's wife. She had made a vow before God and man to honor her husband. Yet, here she was, entertaining thoughts she knew she shouldn't have. One Sunday, after service, Tade offered to help Nancy carry some supplies to her car. As they walked together, he cracked a joke as she laughed. A deep, genuine laugh she hadn't had in months. For a moment, she forgot about her responsibilities, her struggles, and her guilt. But as Tade placed the supplies in her trunk and their hands brushed briefly, reality came crashing back. Nancy pulled her hand away as if she had been burned. "Thank you, Tade. I should go now." Tade's expression was unreadable, but he nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Have a great day." As Nancy drove home, her heart was a whirlwind of emotions. What was happening to her? How had she allowed herself to get here? And most importantly, how could she stop this before it went too far? The tension in Nancy's heart grew day by day. She was torn between her desire for attention and the guilt of betraying her husband's trust. She knew she needed to make a decision, but what would she choose? And how would it impact her marriage, her husband's ministry, and her own work with God? One Sunday, after the service, Nancy approached Tade. "Brother Tade, can we meet in my office now?" Tade, unsuspecting, followed her. Nancy thanked him profusely, speaking with a soft, almost intimate tone. She laid hands on him to pray for his continued success, her hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Tade, deeply spiritual, thought nothing of it and left the office feeling blessed. But Nancy's advances grew bolder. She would find excuses to call Tade, asking for updates on his business or sharing revelations she claimed to have received about him. Each time, Tade's respect for her grew, but Nancy's intentions became more conflicted. Business or sharing revelations she claimed to have received about him. Each time, Tade's respect for her grew, but Nancy's intentions became more conflicted. One evening, Nancy called Tade to her office, saying she had a message from God about his finances. "I saw a revelation," she said as they sat down. "The enemy is planning to attack your business, and we need to pray to cancel it." Tade, ever trusting, agreed. As they began to pray, Nancy asked him to hold hands. Her prayer started strong and fervent, but soon, her touch became more personal. She caressed his hand gently, her voice dropping to a softer tone. At first, Tade thought she was just moved by the spirit. But when her hand drifted to his chin and shoulder, he opened his eyes, startled. Nancy's eyes met his, and he saw something he hadn't expected: desire. "What's going on, ma'am?" Tade asked, pulling his hands away. Nancy smiled coyly. "What do you mean? Would you say you don't understand my body language all this while? Just make me happy, that's all." Tade felt a wave of shock and embarrassment wash over him. The idea that this was coming from the wife of his beloved pastor was unthinkable. How could I do this to Pastor Kunle? Never. Tade thought within himself. He felt an overwhelming wave of guilt and disbelief that this situation had even come to pass. However, he knew he had to handle it delicately to avoid unnecessary drama or a false narrative that could destroy the church's unity and his integrity. "Okay, ma, that's good. Let me check if the door is locked so no one will bump into us, Tade said, masking his shock and feigning compliance. "Don't worry, the door is locked," Nancy replied, her tone confident. "All right then, let me quickly get a condom from my car. We need to protect ourselves," he added, hoping to buy time and escape the situation. Nancy allowed him to leave the room without suspicion, but as soon as Tade reached his car, he drove off, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He resolved never to return to the church. As he drove home, Tade reflected on the situation and recalled the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife from the Bible. He remembered how Joseph's refusal to succumb to temptation had saved his destiny, even though it came at great personal cost. "Women can be so tricky," he muttered to himself. "But I thank God for wisdom to handle this." Can you imagine? Pastor Kunle's wife. This is unbelievable. When Tade arrived home, he fell on his knees and poured his heart out to God. "Lord, forgive me for even being in this compromising situation. Cleanse my thoughts and protect Pastor Kunle's ministry. Help Sister Nancy overcome this spirit of lust." Nancy, on the other hand, waited for Tade's return in vain. She began calling his phone repeatedly, but he refused to pick up. After about 20 missed calls, Tade finally answered. "Sister Nancy, I know you are struggling, but this has to stop," he said firmly. "You need to deal with your flesh. Galatians 5:16 says, 'Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh.' You have a great calling on your life, and the devil is trying to destroy it." Nancy felt her heart break. She burst into tears, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. "Tade, I'm so sorry," she said through sobs. "Thank you for reminding me who I am in Christ. Thank you for not giving in to my weakness." That night, Nancy fell to her knees and cried out to God, "Lord, I have sinned against you and my husband. Forgive me, purge me of this lust, and help me to honor my marriage covenant." She meditated on Psalm 51, asking God to create a clean heart within her and renew her spirit. Nancy's confession to Pastor Kunle was one of the hardest things she had ever done. She expected anger and rejection, but instead, Kunle held her hands and prayed for her. Though he was deeply hurt, his commitment to their marriage and God's will kept him steadfast, and together they sought counseling and spiritual guidance to rebuild their relationship. Nancy became intentional about dying to the flesh. She immersed herself in the Word of God, meditating on scriptures like 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13. "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." Nancy began to reflect the qualities of the Proverbs 31 woman. She became more focused on building her home, supporting her husband's ministry, and nurturing her personal relationship with God. Tade never returned to the church, but he continued to pray for Nancy and Pastor Kunle from afar. His decision to flee from temptation saved him from sin and maintained his integrity. Now to the moral of the story. Believers, whether you hold a title in the church or not, must die to the flesh and submit completely to the Spirit. Even those filled with the Spirit, seeing visions and being used mightily in ministry, are not immune to temptation. Galatians chapter 5 verse 17 reminds us that, for the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. It is your duty to suppress the desires of the flesh and align with the will of God. This requires intentionality, praying, fasting, studying the word, and setting boundaries. When faced with temptation, heed the instruction in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 22. Flee from all appearances of evil. Flee when the evil is still far away. Do not entertain or justify it. Flee immediately, for no one is above temptation. Even Jesus Christ was tempted. Let this story serve as a reminder to guard your heart, walk by the Spirit, and live a life that honors God in all things. I hope this story has blessed you. If you enjoyed this story, you will definitely love the next one. Click to watch it now. Goodbye.